of highest proportion of impacted workers?
Yes, you do bring up a good point. We do find that the industries that are most likely to be affected by the proposed minimum wages are service-type jobs and less likely to be manufacturing-type jobs. And this is for a few reasons. First, these jobs are specifically places that are based off of employee relationships. It's based off of being physically in the room. It's reliant on human interaction. It's not just something that can be easily exported, as you note. The reason why we find this change in the minimum wage does not change the employment levels of these industries as much is because we do see a change in the kind of labor that is produced. We do find that there's a reduction in turnover because the workers that are in this industry feel they have some level of assurance after a change in the minimum wage, and we find that I suppose. Am I getting at your question? I feel like I'm missing something.
Yeah, I think so. I guess I just kind of wanted to have your expert analysis of my take on what we had seen. And it also struck me that, the way that, so the study didn't cover this question about businesses deciding whether or not to be in Minneapolis or not. And it struck me that these are industries as well that make location decisions in part based on the fact that they're really part of our local economy, that they're not a factory that may locate in Minneapolis or in St. Paul or in Georgia or something based on all of these different price costs. So that it seemed also important to me to understand that how these kinds of businesses are making location decisions versus these other kinds of more export-based companies.
Yes. So the point that I think you're bringing up is that, these positions are particularly places where you have to be in the room to be able to deliver these services. You can't export a haircut, and you can't export elderly living facilities. You have to be available to be at that location. And the reason why we find that there's prevalence of the minimum wage in these industries is because these are that we don't find a change in employment in these industries is because these are industries who need people. These are industries who can't replace people very easily with technology or with other means. And we find that in response to the change in the minimum wage, they still need people. And they maybe see a change in the employee-employer relationship, but the fact that they still need employees to offer these services is a part of what it is that they're producing. That's what the good is that they have. It's a service good. So that's part of the reason why we find that.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the report. And there's a lot more online and a lot more in the report to think about and figure out. I was a little bit curious about the poverty status and related to its impact. It looked like you identified there's 19,000 people who work in Minneapolis that are part of the workforce, but they're living in poverty. And I was curious why not all 19,000 of them would be affected. When I was looking at who would be affected, it looked like 12,000 would be affected workers if we raised the minimum wage to $12, and 14,000 would be affected if we raised the wage to $15 an hour. So I was just curious about why are some people, even if we raise the minimum wage, why are we still going to have hundreds of people, or in some thousands, I guess, actually still living in poverty? Is that because they're in the workforce, but they're only working part-time? Are they contract employees and they somehow exempt? If you had any information about that, I'd appreciate it.
Yes. So one thing to bring up, you do bring up a good point. The poverty rate is defined as falling below a certain income level, and if someone does not have enough hours, regardless of what wage they earn, if they do not have enough hours to meet that level, they would still fall under poverty status. But in order to go through that part of the analysis, let me hand off that question to David Cooper. So just very briefly to answer your question, Councilman, poverty status is determined by total family income level. So, and each family's respective poverty line is determined by the number of people in their family as well. So you could have one person who's working full time, who may have, 3 dependent family members. And if they're not earning enough for those 4 people, they're still going to be below poverty. At the same time, there are a significant number of folks in poverty who do not work. So if you raise the minimum wage, you're not going to eliminate poverty for those folks. At the same time, in our simulations, we're not assuming any change in hours. So as Thomas was just alluding to, if someone doesn't work enough hours, even if you increase their hourly wage rate, in our simulation, it's not going to necessarily move their income enough to bring them above the poverty line. Plus, we also don't know what's happened to the income, any income going to other members of that family. So that's why you don't see an elimination in poverty, even though our findings do show that folks in poverty who are currently working would be disproportionately affected by the proposals.
Absolutely. So to be considered in the workforce, is there a minimum number of hours that you thought people were working, or is it 1 hour a year, or what?
So in the data, they had to be working. It was a very low bar. They had to be working at least 10 hours a year, something like that. They had to have been working at least some portion of the year in the prior year and earned wage income. Okay.
And so if you were working, do you happen to know how large a family you could have to be out of poverty if you were working full-time, making $15 an hour?
Well, so $15 an hour in 2021 is probably about $13 an hour in today's dollars. So if you're working full-time full year, it's about $26,000 per year in today's dollars. So that would be above the poverty line for a family of 4, but any larger family size would still be below poverty at that level.
Okay. I was also curious if somebody could talk a little bit about the impact this might have on if it would have any impact on employment, because I think part of the idea you're saying is there are people who are living in poverty because they don't have a job. And is there an impact would that help get more people into the workforce or not? There's a lot of fears that it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And I know you said there was one slide at least that mentioned how statistically insignificant that number is.
Sure. I'll let someone else. Bill, did you want to tackle that?
So William Spriggs from Howard University. There wasn't a significant impact on employment. I think you were asking a question which also asked about labor force participation. Would more people be drawn into the market? But we didn't have data to analyze the labor force response. Clearly, more people might be drawn in, but total employment, only because of the minimum wage, total employment didn't change statistically significantly. So we don't get an employment response.
Okay. And then I was also wondering if somebody could share some information about single parents, what impact we'd have on that. It's definitely a concern in the city here, I think, and oftentimes what the parent can make as wages has a great impact on the success of their children. And if we're looking at the long term, we want to make sure that parents have an option to provide for their children. And it looked like on one of the tables, it was a more significant and a larger impact on single parent families, but I was unsure about that.
Sure. To speak to that for one moment, I will comment on one of the findings from Dr. William Rogers, who again cannot be here today. His analysis was looking at food insecurity, which is defined by a survey that's run by the census that asks a series of questions, some of them being very specific to a household's food consumption. And it asks questions like, have you gone without food since your last paycheck, or have you gone without food so that your children could eat? Questions that are related to food consumption. And what he finds is that if you look at Appendix N in the presentation, we find that there would be a reduction in food insecurity for single parents within the city of Minneapolis. We would find a reduction of about 1,000 families' food insecurity, and with a $12 minimum wage, and 2,000 for a $15 minimum wage. One thing that should be noted is that there are also many degrees of food security that Dr. Rogers simulated. So there are some levels of changes which are from very food insecure, going to simply just food insecure, and then from food insecure to food security. So one aspect that we considered of the single parent family would be the impact of food security, and we find that there is a reduction in food insecurity in response to these simulated minimum wages.
Well, that's really interesting, and that makes me kind of say, well, here's a co-benefit maybe that we hadn't looked at or thought about. And I'm wondering if you did any analysis of other co-benefits. I could see how potentially, especially looking at this just generally from my life as my income's gone up, there or other things that I could take care of and deal with. So would there be any kind of reduction in public costs in terms of providing health care to people, trying to find housing, trying to address crime issues? Did you do any kind of calculations looking at possible benefits, to even economic benefits to the general public by raising the minimum wage in the city?
Sure. So there are three things that I would bring up. First, in looking at the change of the city of Minneapolis, there's an ordinance within the city of Minneapolis which requires that persons who are employed by the city earn a livable wage, which would imply a certain percentage above the current poverty line. And when you do the math for this, you would find that the simulated minimum wages actually are comparable to the wage that is in the current Minneapolis city ordinance for its own workers. So we would find that would be first an instance where there is not the effect is the absence of the effect. The fact there's not a large change for example, the payment of workers for the city, because workers within the city are already earning enough to be for that. On the flip side, we also looked at healthcare and we looked at school attendance and education factors. However, we found that these reports were not easily applicable to the Minneapolis area because a lot of them were outdated and were not applicable to the current healthcare market, or were not applicable to Minnesota's education system. But what we find again is because these are service industries that are impacted or that are affected by the minimum wage, the fact that there is a lack of employment effect in these service industries means that there's a lack of the change of persons who are in that industry's workforce. So what we see instead of a change of services is, again, we see just a change of what goes into those services. We see the reduction in turnover. We see an increase of productivity from those workers because they're not moving from job to job as much as would be implied by the turnover rate.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
I'm good for now.
All right. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for your report. I'm wondering if any of the people who are on your project team have opined on the minimum wage issue in public, in the media. If I were to Google all of your names, would I find articles written, papers written, opining in favor of raising the minimum wage?
Would you like to? Yeah.
So you come to it with a opinion, a point of view that you use the research to support, correct?
The Roy Wilkins Center does not take a position to endorse the minimum wages that are simulated here or reject it. We were simply tasked with simulating what the effects would be of this minimum wage.
How many of you have opined in favor of a minimum wage in journals or articles or papers of the people on the team?
Well, I can't speak to myself.
All of you? Basically.
No, just those two.
Just 2 of 4. Okay, I was really hoping we would get a study back that kind of showed us what the cost benefit was, how it would affect businesses. But when I see a report that basically says there's no negative to businesses at all, it's hard for me to consider the report completely unbiased. Was a tip credit, for example, used in your analysis with regard to how restaurants would function? I have a lot of restaurants in my ward, and a 5% increase in their expenses could be the difference between making it and not making it. So while 5% doesn't seem like a lot, and it's certainly portrayed here as no big deal because you say multiple times that the change in employment is not statistically significant, there's no negative to businesses if we do this. But have you actually spoken to businesses who have a margin of profit that is 2 or 3 or 4 or 5%
potentially increasing their costs by that amount could put them out of business. How did you look at that?
First, I would note that again the the increased operating cost that we discussed is also met with a 51% pass through of those costs to consumers. So again, those costs aren't entirely realized by the employer themselves. We also, again, are basing our simulation off of the current Minnesota minimum wage, which does not have a specialized tier for tipped workers. There are, however, areas across the nation that do choose to have a special tier of minimum wages for workers who earn tips. However, Minnesota is not one of those states. And so for our simulation, we assumed that the $12 and $15 minimum wages would employ a similar design, which would also then allow us to rely on historical changes within Minnesota for the basis of our findings, instead of only using national data.
Madam Chair, but in Minneapolis, we don't have the ability to determine whether or not state law changes to allow or not allow a tip credit. So we could be passing a minimum wage without implementing that, or we could be preempted by the state from implementing that, making servers paid $25 an hour in order to get the folks who really have a hard time, which are kitchen workers and bus people, those very hard to fill jobs that also as you know, in our employment in our city, you can't even fill those jobs right now. So the market is deciding what the wage would be as a result of the fact you can't fill those jobs. So I don't know that we can change that. I think what maybe the reason why I'm kind of zoning out to your whole report is that all of your key findings essentially say, it's no big deal, do it. There won't be any effect. There's no effect on businesses. That's exactly what you say. Oh, the amount that we're going to increase is so limited that it won't really have an effect, or you're going to pass it on to a consumer. But when you already are paying $6 for a single scoop ice cream cone, how much more are people going to be willing to pay? I mean, there is a breaking point at which people who even make $15 an hour I wouldn't even consider paying $6 for an ice cream cone. So I can't imagine low-wage workers saying that now they'll pay $7.50 to accommodate a 5% increase in wages. And that's what they would have to do. So I kind of feel like you've underestimated how this would affect businesses while overestimated all of the benefits, including this whole issue of food insecurity. I don't think you need to be an economist to realize that if people get paid more, they have more money and they have less food insecurity. I don't need to have an economics degree to figure that out.
So I would just say, to the extent that you are, I think there was a lot of opinion in there. So I just want to say, the opinion is the opinion, but if there are places to kind of clarify what the study findings are, please let us know.
Sure. So again, first, our simulated change in earnings is not just an increase of the wage rate. It's an increase in the quarterly earnings rate, which means that it could be possible for earners to have their hours cut in this data set. But regardless, we find even if there is a cut in hours, there's still an increase in earnings, and that is offset by a change in the minimum wage. If there were, for example, a large reduction in hours in response to a minimum wage, we could have found a negative effect on earnings if the cut in hours was greater than the increase in the wage rate. But that's not what was suggested by any of the simulations that we ran. Instead, we find an increase in earnings between 10 to 30%. What's more, the design of the simulation that we ran was designed based off of the current minimum wage policy in the rest of Minnesota, because this allows us then to use Minnesota as a basis for comparison for this minimum wage. So although the city council could not obviously run anything contrary to state law, there could be, of course, many ways that a minimum wage of $15 could be cut to have many tiers. However, the simulation that was asked of us was simply of a level of $12 and $15. And a part of that was we had to make assumptions with respect to the large and small firm wage rates. However, this is a function of the fact that Minnesota itself and that Minneapolis workers are currently facing those rates. So to simulate those changes, we would have to have a similar circumstance in 2021 by the end of the simulation. Oh, one other thing that, yes, we would mention is that the earnings and the restaurant price increase and the employment studies, which we use for the basis of our simulations, come from peer-reviewed articles that have been discussed nationally and are not just a matter of a single author's opinion, but these are indeed cited papers from across the country. And they're cited because they have particularly strong findings. They have the techniques that they use are designed to separate what changes happen in response to a minimum wage versus what changes happen throughout the industry already. Indeed, it's possible that there are other factors that would change the prices of the restaurant industry. These studies are able to zone in on the amount of those changes that are causally tied to changes in the minimum wage. But again, that's more of a question of how much of these changes are from the minimum wage versus how much are from other factors that are not necessarily a part of the minimum wage and are not the scope of our simulation.
Thank you. Councilmember Fry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, generally speaking, an expert doesn't become an expert unless they've substantially studied a particular topic. And once you've substantially studied a particular topic and gained knowledge in it, you usually form an opinion. So in the field of minimum wage expertise, I think you have proponents and opponents of it over time. And I don't think that the fact that a couple of the individuals that researched the particular topic gained expertise, gained knowledge, and ultimately opined that in many instances a minimum wage increase is advantageous and beneficial should be
Pointed out.
It certainly can be pointed out, but I don't think that it should be conclusive of some sort of bias beyond the fact that the information has been gathered. I do have a couple questions though about first, I believe I saw a statistic within the larger report stating that about 50% of the low-income workers that would benefit from a minimum wage increase at either the $12 or the $15 level were resided in the city. Is that a correct statistic or close to correct?
Yes, our estimations for 2021 did have a measure for whether or not a person worked in the same location as where they resided. And we were then able to separate people who lived in Minneapolis from people who lived and worked in Minneapolis. And we found about half in 2021.
The particular county that you used in your study within California, what county was that again?
It would be San Jose County, I believe.
So it's my understanding that since that point in time when the county passed a minimum wage increase, the state as a whole has also passed a minimum wage increase, I believe, to the same figure. Is that right? Was this happened? So the study for this particular county happened prior to the state minimum wages increase, right?
So it was San Jose passed a particularly large increase in their minimum wage. I think it was back in 2013, and that's when this particular study looked at changes in restaurant prices in response to that increase. Back in 2013.
Okay, so this was in
and
2013.
Since then, the state of California has passed an increase to a comparable level that will take effect over the next 5 to 6 years.
Okay, so this particular county passed a minimum wage increase. Many other municipalities and counties passed a minimum wage increase, and subsequently the state followed suit.
Correct.
Is there? How did this particular county handle the issue of 1099 wages and tips, et cetera?
California does not have a lower minimum wage for tips. It's the same as Minnesota. So in other words, there is no tip credit in California. So tipped workers get the full minimum wage before tips, just as they do here in Minnesota.
So I guess this leads to my question then. If the state of Minnesota doesn't allow a tip credit for their state minimum wage. However, a minimum wage, one could argue, and in fact I would argue, can be passed that goes beyond the minimum wage set by the state. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking about this today. And if you're able to pass a minimum wage that extends beyond what is required by the state as the base $7.50 or $9.50, then it seems to me that you wouldn't be violating this state tip credit if you still were required to pay the underlying state minimum wage. Does that make sense?
That's a legal question that I have no idea the details of the Minnesota.
Do you understand my question, though?
I do understand your question.
Okay.
It makes some intuitive sense, but again, I don't know the law.
All right. And then if you go back, there was a study that was explaining how many the percentages of people of color that were positively impacted by a minimum wage. And if you could go back to that slide, you had the percentages at $12 and then the percentages at $15. It was early on. There we go. All right, so it says 1/3 African American Latino/Latino workers under $12 would be impacted. Half of workers under 12 or 15 are American Indians and people of color. So do you... So it says half of workers under 12 or 15 are American Indians and or people of color.
So just to be clear, what it's
Yeah.
saying is that under an increase in the minimum wage to $12, 1/3 of African American workers and 1/3 of Latino workers would be affected by that policy change. Then the second bullet is saying of all workers that would be impacted by this policy change, about half of them are people of color.
I understand. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first of all, I want to say thank you to the research team for taking on this task. We asked a lot in terms of studying two different numbers in two different regions. And so I'm going to ask three questions, and I'm going to kind of say a couple of statements at the beginning, but I do have a question on page 53, so I just want to flag that for you so you can get ready. So these reputable scholars that are here today, which have been before the council before, particularly Dr. Myers, who presented to us on the foreclosure crisis, have a pretty good name nationally on tackling issues like this. And so I appreciate the time that you have spent pining over the numbers and putting this together. As a policymaker, what I'm looking for is an overall impact of what this is going to do to the city of Minneapolis and to our region. So while I understand that there will be sort of gives and takes, I am looking at overall impact and analyzing this initiative from that direction. So I'm not surprised that an increase of $15 as a minimum wage would benefit a large portion of our communities of color in Minneapolis. And as such, I think this is the most direct way that we as the city can help close the racial disparities in Minneapolis. And so in thinking about that, I do acknowledge that our small business industry is pretty robust in Minneapolis, especially in the East Lake Street corridor and some of the other corridors in our city. And I think that this is where we as the council need to step up and do more to support our small businesses, addressing the SAC fee issue that we know hurts so many of our small entrepreneurs, and looking at ways to support commercial land trust models so that we're helping those entrepreneurs of color build wealth over time, as well as looking to accompany our comprehensive plan efforts with policy directives that will lift up the cultural corridors of our city and that will have equal investment as we have put into stadiums and other downtown parks over the years. And so with that, I just want to kind of ask three questions, and I'll lay them out so that you can figure out who would be best to address them. We know that in the coming years, people of color will be the majority in our region. And I'm just wondering if these studies looked at any of that in terms of if we keep wages the same way, does that mean that more people of color will be kept in poverty for more years to come? So that's just kind of a thought going on in my head as I look at the future of our city and how we need to lead it. And then there was a bullet point, I believe, on the second, I'm not sure what number slide it might be 4 key findings. The change in business operating cost is estimated to be at its height 5.4% for a $15 minimum wage. I'm just wondering if that is an estimation for all size businesses or for a specific category of business under 500 employees, above 500, or kind of what that number entails. And then my last question is on page 53 of the actual study. You state that the minimum wage of $15 an hour would translate to approximately $31,000 a year. And then you have a chart that kind of lays out what the cost of living is for a parent and a child. And you kind of sum up the total costs of what it takes to live in the area. And that number, that annual number is about $53,500. That gap is still quite large, even if the city council did decide to lead and approve a $15 minimum wage ordinance. So I'm just curious about where that $53,000 number came from. I understand that you're looking at rent, food, childcare. I'm just curious about the sources of those numbers, because I could see many people thinking, that's crazy. It doesn't cost $53,000 to live in our city. I think we know better, because many of us up here on this dais would not be able to make a healthy living and raise our children on $30,000 or $50,000 a year. I have 3 boys, so I know the grocery bills are very expensive. So if you could please just kind of walk me through those 3 questions, I would really appreciate it.
Sure. I plan on answering 2 of the questions that you addressed, and then I'll hand off you're referring to the family budget simulation that we ran. I'll be handing that off later. So first point that you brought up is that there is a growing non-white community in Minneapolis. One thing that we observed when we started to look at the size of firms in Minneapolis is that if you look at who is eligible to pay the higher versus the lower minimum wage, the $9.50 versus the $70.75 currently, you find actually that minority-owned businesses, as defined by the Dun & Bradstreet credit rating agency, we find that they are actually more likely to be a large business than their peers in the surrounding areas, which then means that in our simulation, given that we've assumed, again, no change in behavior from in the response of firms in their choice between the small and large minimum wages, that would imply that minority-owned firms are already paying a certain amount and are, I guess, that much closer to the $12 or $15 number, and that they kind of already have that as a starting point. One thing that I would notice about the second comment that I would make about the 5.4 number is that this was generated. This one is specifically from the restaurant industry simulation that we ran, and it was particularly the largest number that we were able to find. We simulated several industries, but most of which actually had less than 1% changes in operational costs, because most industries do not employ enough persons below the $12 or $15 rate to be affected as largely. However, taking again the scenario that EPI has suggested, where there's no change in hours worked and no change in staffing and no change in the techniques that are used, if all you did was pay for that increase out of pocket, it would be a 5.4% increase in operating costs for the average restaurant industry, the average firm in the restaurant industry in the area. With that, I'm going to pass this off to David Cooper for any other comments on the industry simulation and the family budget.
So just to clarify on your second question, Councilwoman, the price estimates do not make any differentiation about firm size. It's just not possible in the data. It's just the average. On the question on the family budget, so the data that you're seeing there come from a tool that the Economic Policy Institute has published for many years called the Family Budget Calculator. And we collect data from about a dozen public sources on location-specific costs of housing, food, childcare, healthcare, other necessities, taxes, and then we aggregate that for over 600 communities in the U.S. And in this case, we used the data for the Minneapolis-St. Paul MSA. It was the smallest geography we could get in the data. And what we find is that when we look at what it takes to have a modest but secure standard of living, so to be fair, this is not absolute destitution. This is some measure of financial security. It would take one adult with one child about $53,000 a year to have that standard of living in Minneapolis today. And I should note that this is really just paying for those basics. It does not include any sort of savings, no savings for rainy day, no savings for retirement, no extra money to spend on enrichment for your child, for example. So you're right. When you point out that $15 an hour in 2021 would be about $31,000 a year for someone working full-time full year, there is still a gap between what that income would generate and what we think you would need to have a modest but secure standard of living in Minneapolis. So that would speak to the fact that, for a lot of folks, just having a job may not be enough. You may need other supports in addition to their income from work.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too would like to add my thanks for all the researchers and the team for working on this project on our behalf. I have a rather simple question because there's so much information. It's going to take me a long time to really digest it. I'm not going to draw any conclusions one way or the other, but I'd really like to know how, in an example of a single firm that had, as an example, 2 employees. One was paid the $9.50 minimum wage, the state minimum wage, and the other employee was at $12.50. So there's a $3 delta. When you do the calculus for identifying how many people would be affected by a $12, suddenly that $12 one wouldn't be impacted. And then you add in the 15, if you add in that $3 difference, that second person wouldn't be calculated or impacted by that. Is the $3 differential between one employee and another employee maintained in the study, or is it separated out and only treated as less than 12, less than 15?
So one comment about that, the simulation, I'll pass this off to David Cooper in a moment, but there is a series of tiers that each worker is categorized into based off of their relative distance to the current minimum wage. And the simulation then uses that distance as a basis. One thing that's especially noteworthy about this is that the category that is used by EPI does maintain the current ratio between the existing small firm and large firm minimum wage and the commensurate wages. And with the techniques of that, I would pass that off to David Cooper. So forgive me if I get too far in the weeds here. But the way the simulation works is we take everyone's current wage. So the situation you're describing, that $7.50 and $12 or whatever it was. What we do then is we iterate each step in the increase in the minimum wage. So if the first step is in the $12 simulation, it was 60. We simulated 5 steps of 60 cents. We did that first 60-cent step, and any worker in the data who made less than that new minimum that's now 60 cents above the existing minimum, we mark them. We say that they've been impacted. We calculate their change in wages, and then we assume some natural nominal wage growth in between each year. So basically, because we're projecting out 5 years, we're assuming that there's going to be some sort of natural wage growth occurring, even absent the minimum wage increase, because that's just what happens in the economy. As prices go up, employers will slowly raise pay, at least to match those prices, we hope. As that process iterates forward, when you get to 2021, that person who was making $12.50 at the beginning of the process, because we've been assuming they're getting some increase that whole time, they may now be outside the range of where they would get picked up in the identification of who's getting a minimum wage increase, but the person who was making $7.50 is clearly still going to be in the range of who would get picked up
in identifying who would be affected by the minimum wage increase. So that's the way the simulation works. It basically grows people's wages out at some assumption of natural nominal wage growth, which in this case we assumed would be the projections for inflation, CPI. And then we said, as you slowly raise the minimum wage, how many more people are you going to catch through that process with each step going up and up and up? And that's how we come up with our number.
I think I understand it, but just really succinctly.
Mm-hmm.
In 2021, is there a $3 difference between employee 2 and employee 1?
Gotcha. So no. So we assume that there's going to be some compression in the wage distribution at the bottom of the wage distribution because of that rising floor.